highlight of the opening ceremony. It's always customary to begin these with the Anetskov Prize. And it gives me enormous pleasure to recognize an individual who has contributed not just so much to science, but to the EAS Society. I was with him last night having dinner, and I said, EAS, blood flows through your veins. When I put this together, it's really incredible. By way of background, he completed his medical degree in 1985, completed postgraduate studies in Copenhagen, and like many people, went to other institutions. Collaboration is important. And he went to Cornell, and he also went to London, and he spent 2 years. He then completed his doctorate from the University of Copenhagen in 1990. What are his achievements? They are many. We wouldn't have enough time if I was going to go through all of those, but here are a few. What are his skills? What does he do? Well, he utilizes the strengths of large-scale, prospective observational population studies and randomized interventional trials. His work has been published in all the leading journals, including the New England Journal of Medicine, the Lancet, JAMA, Science, and Nature. Many of these, and many more I'm sure in the future, will impact, have impacted, and will impact international and national guidelines. Like all visionaries, he created something with an eye on the future. In 2003, he founded the Copenhagen General Population Study, which now includes more than 150,000 individuals. His contribution to the field is legendary. His mechanistic, epidemiological, and genetic research prompted a reappraisal of the role of triglyceride-rich lipoproteins in the causal pathway of atherosclerosis. These data have been pivotal to consideration of lipid-lowering therapy for elevated triglyceride and remnant cholesterol to prevent CVD, including the development of new therapies. How could anybody talk about Borg without mentioning lipoprotein a? His research on Lp(a) has been pivotal in recognizing its role as a causal risk factor for cardiovascular disease and, notably, aortic valve calcification and stenosis. Let's not forget his legacy. He has been a key member of numerous EAS consensus groups and the European Federation of Laboratory Medicine on quantifying atherogenic lipoproteins, including the need not for fasting samples. What I like most about him is, whilst he's doing all of this work, if you actually go, and if you're fortunate enough to be invited to one of the meetings in Copenhagen, the Scandinavian Atherosclerosis Society, the passion that he has for each and every one of his students, the time he gives, and the legacy of that is many of them are senior professors, established, developing their own field. That is as important, if not more important, than those other achievements. So it's my great pleasure to invite to the stage Borg Nordestegard, this year's winner of the Anetskov Lecture 2022, and his chosen topic is remnant cholesterol.
Thank you so much, Kos, for these very kind words. It's way too much. I would also like to thank, of course, EAS and all the ones that have been involved in deciding that I should give this lecture and have this prize. I'm really deeply honored. It is a privilege to give this talk, just like Kos said before, but it's also something on your shoulders. First of all, I have to try to say something 40 minutes, so not too many people leave the back door or fall asleep. So that's a big challenge, I would say. So we've just heard these short and brief introductions. I'll see what I can do. It's easy to give this talk because you just get this email and they say, what do you want to talk about? And well, so you decide really. So I could have chosen many things, and then I chose remnant cholesterol. Why did I do that? I think two reasons. It's because this is very close to when I started as a young researcher. And I worked on it ever since, and it's still here, and I don't hope so, it has finished yet. The other thing is that I would like to sort of like brainwash all of you so that you would, in the end, think that you should not talk about triglyceride-rich lipoproteins, but talk about remnant cholesterol, just like LDL cholesterol. It's equally important. So just, can you remember? Remnant cholesterol. That's the two reasons. So let's get started. So when I was a very young scientist, starting in Copenhagen, this was sort of like what was shown in front of me by one of my supervisors, Steen Stender, namely that on the one hand, we had the cholesterol. It was very well established. Severe hypercholesterolemia, familial hypercholesterolemia, leading to tendinophanxiomas and myocardial infarction. And on the other hand, we had this other genetic condition, namely severe hypertriglyceridemia, familial chylomicronemia, where you see this eruptive xanthomas and acute pancreatitis. And when you read these two chapters, which I did back then, from Brown and Goldstein on FH, from Nicola from Finland on chylomicronemia syndrome. Chylomicronemia syndrome, it says it gives no heart disease, and FH, it gives no pancreatitis. So therefore, everybody thought triglycerides is not important. Cholesterol is the only important thing. So the way I'll do this talk, I'll have these blue boxes, and now I'll start with some basic science involving animals and humans. But then I have all these other ones, because some people think it's too boring if I spend 40 minutes to show you data. So I also have these green boxes. So like, it's a bit, well, playing the narrator, or you could say editorial comments, or I'm sure some will say just an old man just saying stupid things. But I'll do a little bit of both. So if you like the pure science, you can listen for the blue. If you just like what I think about it, then you can look at the green ones, really. So this is where I started, young medical student. That's what I looked like. I started with animals, lots of rabbits, cholesterol-fed rabbits, really. My early scientific training included working with Steen Stender in Copenhagen. Then, as Kos already said, I went to work with Donald Silversmith at Cornell University in New York, and then from there to Barry Lewis in London, UK. And the two first studies I did was to try to explain why was it severe hypertriglyceridemia was not associated with atherosclerosis while high cholesterol was. And here's sort of like the bottom line of these two papers that I published together with my supervisors, shown down below, namely that if you have the chylomicrons, you have these huge lipoproteins, and they're really too large. They don't come into the arterial wall. Just very few of the small ones, the LDLs, come into the arterial wall. Therefore, no atherosclerosis. On the other hand, if there's no chylomicrons, but only LDLs, and also a few remnants, then certainly we could measure using isotope methods that then LDL comes into the arterial wall a lot. So to be more detailed about these studies showed from Copenhagen and Cornell University was that I was also able to measure the size of the lipoproteins. So the lipoproteins you have when triglycerides is low, here like 2 millimoles per liter, are less than 75 nanometers in diameter. But if you have these very large triglycerides, 177 millimoles per liter or 15,000 milligram per deciliter, which we created by making rabbits diabetic by injecting alloxan. Then the lipoproteins are huge, more than 75 nanometers, and we could show that they could not come into the arterial wall. They're too large to enter, whereas LDL could easily come into the arterial wall. So based on this understanding, for me it was so obvious, of course, if you have the remnants in between that have medium size between LDL and chylomicrons, maybe they come into the arterial wall. Maybe they actually get stuck more in there than what LDL normally does. So that's what I set out to try to show and convince the world about. I was helped a little bit. Barry Lewis, that I worked with in London, he was the first author of the first 2 guidelines on how to treat dyslipidemia or hyperlipidemia based on the European Atherosclerosis Society. And here's a table in his one of his first guidelines, namely that, as I showed you before, familial hypercholesterolemia, it gives very high cardiovascular disease risk, no risk of pancreatitis. It has very high cholesterol and nothing with triglycerides. And then down here, the chylomicronemia syndrome, no coronary heart disease, a lot of risk of acute pancreatitis, not very high cholesterol, but hugely elevated triglycerides. And then this is third one. I saw some of these patients in working in the lipid clinic with Barry Lewis and also Gerald Watts, actually. The remnant hyperlipidemia, that's what they call it back then. They had the same type of risk like familial hypercholesterolemia, hardly any risk of pancreatitis, a little bit, but then it was dominated by both high cholesterol and high triglycerides remnants. If you have seen some of these patients, and I have in lipid clinics, then that's what they look like. So remnant hyperlipidemia, it's also called type 3 hyperlipidemia or dysbeta-lipoproteinemia. They have these palmar crease xanthomas. You can see cholesterol deposits in the palms of the hands. And then also on the elbows, tuberoeruptive xanthomas. And they have accelerated atherosclerosis and premature cardiovascular disease. So I set out to try to show this was because these medium-sized lipoproteins actually do come into the arterial wall and get trapped there. So I had this series of 4 different papers together with Barry Lewis in London. The top one in humans, the 3 bottom ones in a specific rabbit strain that they found in London called the St. Thomas's Hospital rabbit strain that had both high triglycerides and high cholesterol without being cholesterol fit. What we really showed in these studies was that here now, including remnants, and I actually, to convince myself and other people, isolated them, the lipoproteins, the LDL, the IDL, and the VLDL, and put them into an electron microscope to really measure the diameter of them, just to look at them. And you can see yourself, I mean, the VLDL are really the remnants, a bit of the IDL. They have about this size, and the LDL are much smaller. They have this size. And then, again, using isotope methods, we could show that both LDL and remnants come into the arterial wall, but LDL probably seems to efflux faster than LDL. You should note that none of these lipoproteins can come into the media. They're too large to penetrate these elastic laminas. So the remnant tended to get trapped a bit more than LDL. And then I was just thinking is a good thing to do. When I saw these plaques from humans, atherosclerotic plaques, this is a coronary artery, you can actually see the yellow color here being cholesterol that is accumulating here, just come directly from, well, not directly from, but it's similar to the cholesterol you find in egg yolk. And there's no triglyceride, the white stuff you see down here. Triglyceride does not deposit in the arterial intima. So for me, it has always been, and I know so many people, they keep saying you should focus on plasma triglycerides, but that's only a marker of the remnants. So the plasma triglycerides measure both the triglycerides and the remnants in HDL and in LDL. So I've always focused, let's focus on the cholesterol in these particles. I call it remnant cholesterol. Remnant cholesterol, what we do is just very simple. We just take plasma cholesterol, subtract LDL cholesterol, and subtract HDL cholesterol. There's now also assays, so you can actually measure it directly. Data is very important, but I think if you mix it with thinking, then it becomes much more important, and that gives you insight. And I think when you read old papers, then you realize that's what scientists did in the past. Sometimes today you see people just present a lot of data with not so much thinking, but there's also people that think a lot and don't have so much data. But what better can I do to illustrate this at Anichko's legendary paper from 1913, where he started the cholesterol hypothesis. What he really showed in this paper, published in German originally in 1913. That was the main scientific language before the Second World War, and then it was translated into English in Arteriosklerosis in 1983, if any should be interested in reading it. What he could show was that if you, to rabbits, fed animal products, some of them developed atherosclerosis, and he ended up realizing this was only if you fed them egg yolk, and then from egg yolk, he isolated cholesterol and fed that to rabbits, and then could see only in that situation did the rabbits get atherosclerosis. They got this plasma that looked like not LDL, but actually remnants. It's beta VLDL. It's not LDL that cholesterol-fed rabbits has. They have remnants, and then you get atherosclerosis. Another big thinker, unfortunately, he died some years ago, Daniel Steinberg. He wrote this comment in Journal of Lipid Research 100 years after Anichko has his paper, and he wrote, Anichko's work should have galvanized the scientific community and encouraging innovative approaches to this major human disease, but nothing happened for years and years. And then he commented, here's a classic example of how rigid, preconceived ideas sometimes stand in the way of scientific progress. And I'm sure that it's all of us, certainly me sometimes. So Daniel Steinberg said, why did no one ask the now obvious questions? How is the cholesterol carried in the rabbit blood? How does it get into the arterial wall? And then I got into next interest in early genetic studies. I teamed up with this scientist, Ann Tyberg Hansen. We also married and have a couple of kids together. But that was a very fruitful collaboration. The first genetic study, one of them we did together, was to, because I read this much about lipoprotein lipase deficiency, giving the chylomicronemia syndrome shown as white plasma. Just thinking, well, maybe we could show that if you look at the heterozygotes, this is namely a recessive disease with homozygosity. What about the heterozygotes? Maybe they give this remnant hyperlipidemia, high triglycerides, and high cholesterol. And that's what we set up to try to understand. And here's 3 of the papers. There was more papers in that series, but trying to understand the first one up front, heterozygous lipoprotein lipase deficiency, does it increase triglycerides and remnants? Does it lead to more cardiovascular disease? And this is sort of like this first paper published in Circulation in 1997, where I'll just walk you through the data a little bit. So over here, these are heterozygous lipoprotein lipase deficiency in the Danish population out of 10,000 individuals. This was old-fashioned. We did hand-isolated DNA on 10,000 individuals, and we did RFLPs and agarose deals on 10,000. So that was huge back then. Not like today, you just buy something from a company and they'll fix it for you. What we could show was that heterozygous lipoprotein lipase deficiency had 1 millimole per liter higher cholesterol, that is no triglycerides, that is 88 milligram per deciliter, and this led to a 6-fold increased risk of ischemic heart disease. And then in this meta-analysis by Hans Wittrup some years later, where he pooled all the data available back then, what you could see was that for this one variant, the 188, the most common one leading to chylomicronemia syndrome, the triglycerides went up by 1 millimole and the hazard ratio by 6, as I showed you. But you can then calculate that this is corresponding to a 0.5 millimoles per liter increase in remnant cholesterol, or 17 milligram per deciliter. We also looked at these other mutations, which has minor effects. So 2 other ones, the 9-position amino acid change, the 291, they also had slightly increased, and the 447 that had low triglycerides and remnant had lower risk. I was very fond when I saw Ahmed Kira's paper here in JAMA 20 years after our publication, and he very honestly quoted our first paper. But what they did here was based on many more people. They found a total here of approximately 20 times as many carriers as we had in our original study. And what they showed was that this meant that remnant cholesterol went up by 5 5.6 milligram per deciliter or 0.15 millimoles per liter. So that's only a third of what we found in our Copenhagen studies. But they still found that an increased odds ratio of coronary heart disease of 1.8, corresponding to a little bit less increase in remnants and triglycerides. And then I come to some of these green boxes because I think it gets too boring with all this data. So what gives me inspiration? I like the arts, like we just had now. I think that's what helps me sometimes. If I go places, I go and see an exhibition, I go and see some architecture, and then I start thinking about other things. I'm sure many of you have the same way. I always think of scientists, just like artists. They have some common things, namely that only the artists that think new ways of doing it, and they are original in what they present. If they do that, and they work very, very hard, and then they present it to the world, then they are recognized. That's exactly the same that happened to us as scientists. Something about epidemiology, that was the next we started on after the animal studies and the early genetics. And here we have these couple of studies in Copenhagen, this Copenhagen City Heart Study, which is a very old one, just made very similar to the Framingham Heart Study. And then, as Kost said, I personally started this one below the Copenhagen General Population Study later to get more statistical powers. I know today we have the UK Biobank that is even larger. The beauty of these studies, like in the UK Biobank, is that we have no losses to follow up, and we have followed them for up to 45 years. So how did it go with this epidemiology? Well, this was the first time I presented something about plasma triglycerides and remnant cholesterol. This was at this annual Scandinavian Atherosclerosis Society, Kost just referred to, in 1999. And we have this way of organizing meetings that there's two chairmen, and they have a session, and then they can choose two invited speakers, one from Scandinavia and one from outside, and nobody really interferes. And then Gerald Watts and I, we were asked to chair the session, and then we thought, what would be the best people to give talks here? And then Gerald Watts, he suggested me, and I suggested him. So that's how we do it. So if there's some young people that wants to be up on stage, just to organize a session, and you might have a chance to do that yourself, actually. So this was the first time I showed some data on this epidemiology and high triglycerides. And here's the data I showed based on the Copenhagen City Heart Study. This was much larger than any study at that stage. What we did was we took the plasma triglycerides at baseline, the ones that had less than 1 millimole and steps of 1 millimole higher to more than 5 millimoles per liter. This is like the lowest group less than 88 milligram per deciliter, the top group more than about 450 milligram per deciliter. And you can see for risk of myocardial infarction in both women and men, just this one plasma triglyceride, non-fasting at baseline, had a huge impact of predicting who would have a myocardial infarction. And we also looked at all-cause mortality and saw similar thing, a huge increase in all-cause mortality for both women and men. You can see there's many deaths here. But then I thought, well, how can I ever get this published? Because this was sort of like the landscape. If you're on the x-axis, you see years of progressing. And here's really my personal view of the clinical focus on lipoprotein cardiovascular disease prevention. When I started, it was here. There was equal focus on high cholesterol, high LDL, and high remnants and high triglycerides. But then came the HDL wave because of HDL epidemiological was better than triglycerides and remnant, and nobody believed in triglycerides. Whenever I talked about it, they said, oh, have you adjusted for HDL? And we hadn't measured HDL cholesterol. I couldn't do that. So I didn't know what to do with that data, really. And so it took 8 years before I got myself together and wrote up the paper and submitted it. And then it was published in JAMA, actually. Here first one, and then later together with Annette Warburg, we had pooled even not just for the Copenhagen City Heart Study, also the Copenhagen General Population Study published in the Lancet in a review. And here you can see now with 96,000 individuals from Denmark on the endpoint myocardial infarction that are 99.5% correct, we have tested, and 3,300 events. Just one single measurement of non-fasting triglycerides, the higher the levels, the higher the risk of myocardial infarction. If you look at all-cause mortality, you see very similar, of course, less effect sizes, but still 2.5-fold increased risk of dying. And then in that same paper on non-fasting triglycerides, I put in these two graphs also because I had to try to explain to people that it's not just triglycerides, it might be the cholesterol content. So here, for time since the last meal, we asked people in the Copenhagen General Population Study, what is the level of triglycerides on top, and here remnant cholesterol, and you can see it actually goes up. So here, 2 to 5 hours after the last meal, you get the highest level. That's the best time to get that additional risk. And then over here, we also tried to show that when non-fasting triglycerides go up, then remnant cholesterol goes up, and that's probably the explanation. So not a lot of papers, but some are there. This is the first time I put that remnant lipoprotein cholesterol in writing in the JAMA paper. And then our group, we published some here. But now, I'm very happy to see now there's other researchers that follow that actually start to use that same term to try to simplify it. And then a year later, Jakob Freiberg, he had this other paper from our group published also in JAMA, but now this was on risk of ischemic stroke, also going up, just following people for 20, 30 years. There was like 3,000 strokes here. There was this emergent risk factor collaboration, and they could actually show the same, all these epidemiological studies pooled together. And what you can see here is the usual mean levels in milligram per deciliter of triglycerides, and then the hazard ratio for coronary heart disease. And just like in our studies, when you pool all the studies, risk goes up enormously. In that study, they also showed that if you adjust for cholesterol in both HDL, LDL, and remnants, there's nothing more of triglycerides. For me, supporting that it's the cholesterol content you go for, that's probably the culprit. And trying to explain that here, we've shown that many times, but down below here is non-fasting triglycerides in the Copenhagen General Population Study. As you can see, as triglycerides go up, HDL cholesterol goes down. This is because of CETP that exchanges cholesterol and triglycerides, and remnant cholesterol go up. So when you adjust the triglyceride association for both remnant cholesterol and HDL cholesterol, of course the association goes away because you adjust for what is actually the causal factor. Now here's some distraction again. That's what distracts me. I love travel, so I just go, and if somebody is bored now, you can see this is where I've traveled overland so far. And I didn't put in all the single flights I flew because these days you shouldn't talk too much about where you fly, but I had some very interesting, I like this trip here, was fantastic. As a medical student, I took the train up through Scandinavia, all through Russia, this was Soviet Union, down through China, and ended up in Hong Kong. So that's a good trip if anybody wants to do something like that. Here's another very good one. You can go overland here from starting Jerusalem, and you can actually go all the way down to Cape Town. I just missed Sudan because it's difficult to go through. And here's another one, very interesting. Please do that if you get bored with science. Started in New York all the way down through Central America, South America, ended up in Brazil, and then flew home from there. So that's something to entertain you with. And I think it's also inspiring. You talk with other people, you meet other things, and you think differently about science. Then we came to Mendelian randomization to try to prove causality for this remnant cholesterol. And just for those of you that don't really know it for sure, then the principle is that if you have a randomized trial, you recruit patients into the trial. There's a randomization, you flip a coin, some get a placebo and some get a drug that either reduces or increases a lipoprotein. And then the confounders are equally distributed. And then you can look at what's the risk of cardiovascular disease. Mendelian randomization is exactly the same. When you have children, it's a play of chance what genes you give to your different kids. So some get a normal allele, some get a allele that lifelong give higher low lipoprotein levels. The confounders are equally distributed. And it's amazing, if you do 100,000 people, there's the same number of smokers in the two different genotype groups, just like in the randomized trials, and you can look at the risk of cardiovascular disease. The other problem of epidemiology, namely reverse causation, there's no way that cardiovascular disease can change the genes of a person or how you're randomized into trials. So these two big problems of epidemiology, they simply go away. And later I read these two papers by George David Smith and Shah Ibrahim, and I think he's a fantastic thinker from Bristol in the UK. So if some of you want to know more about it, read these two fantastic starting papers. And to be quite honest, I mean, George David is one of the smartest persons I've ever met. He's definitely smarter than I am, that's for sure. So we tried to use these principles together with Annette Warburg here in a paper published in JACC. Again, we are still haunted about this HCl because back then everybody says, well, it's not triglycerides, it's not remnant, it is HCl that is the important thing. So what we tried to do here was to do epidemiologically in 68,000 individuals, looking at higher and higher levels of remnant cholesterol, what's the risk of ischemic heart disease? And if we did the same for HCl, it's just lower and lower levels, you can see the same association. That's why people said it's probably HCl, not remnant cholesterol. So then we wanted to use genetic to try to convince at least ourselves and hopefully also part of the world. So we did this first study. So observationally, you can see here, this is for a 1 millimole increase in the lipoprotein or 1 millimole decrease in HCl. What is the observational association for risk of ischemic heart disease? And here for remnant cholesterol alone, here's both remnant cholesterol and low HCl, here's low HCl. Oops. You can suddenly see HCl for the same change in cholesterol is more important observationally than the remnants. And then LDL, the positive control, very similar to remnants. But then Annette and I, we picked out all these 15 selected genetic variants that only looked at one of these 4 types of groups lifelong. And then the picture looked completely different. So the ones that increased remnant cholesterol, they had higher risk of ischemic heart disease than seen observationally. HDL became null, and LDL did exactly as expected, higher risk than observationally. There's many papers from our group on this, and I think this is a very important one from Anders Berg-Wolf, his name now, and Ty Bøgh Hansen being the senior author, back-to-back publication with another paper in New England Journal of Medicine on ApoC3. And what these 2 papers really showed, Annette and I put here in the Lancet paper, was to try to show that if you have these loss of function in ApoC3, you have 44% lower triglycerides. That's also roughly 44% lower remnant cholesterol in our study and 39% in the US study. And that translated into approximately 40% lower risk of ischemic vascular disease. And just for comparison, we put in the PCSK9 mutation, loss of function. It get less lower LDL and less risk. So I think this was 2 very important papers. There's lots of other papers, and here's sort of like most of them. And you can see many of them are published in the New England Journal of Medicine and other high-ranking journals, but they all come to the same conclusion. So all the genetic studies, they say that triglyceride remnants, they cause cardiovascular disease, and it is independent of levels of LDL cholesterol and HDL cholesterol. Here's something else that distracts me and gives inspiration. That's also thinking about other scientists, some that are much greater than most of us, certainly than me. So I like to read about scientists and follow them. And certainly many of them are fantastic. Here's Gregor Mendel and Charles Darwin, that is important for some of the studies that we did, and also Anichko over here. Right now I'm actually reading this book here, August and Marie Krogh, who August, he got the Nobel Prize. He was at the same time as Niels Bohr for a lot of physiology and capillary physiology, and the 2 together was the one that brought insulin from Canada to Denmark, and thereby the Novo Nordisk company that you know is a pretty big company today. Something about mechanism inclusive of inflammation. How we thought about it, it would most likely be was that while LDL come into the arterial wall and get trapped, then remnants get trapped even more. And then lipoprotein lipase at the surface of these particles could lead to liberation of free fatty acids and monosaccharides, leading to local inflammation. Could also be taken up directly by macrophages to produce foam cells. And this could easily be part of the mechanism of the remnants. And here's just some evidence from large studies. It's about 115,000 persons from our Copenhagen studies. 2 papers, one in circulation and one in clinical chemistry, that shows as plasma triglyceride goes up, plasma C-reactive protein on the whole population goes up, illustrating more low-grade inflammation. In exactly the same people, when we look at LDL cholesterol, there's no evidence. When LDL goes up, CRP does not increase. It's the triglycerides and remnants. So how I envision it is that from the triglyceride lipoproteins to disease, that we know from the chylomicrons with triglyceride, lipoprotein lipase can degrade free fatty acids, and they're toxic to tissue, probably leading to inflammation wherever they come. And if so, in the pancreas, acute pancreatitis. The remnants, or VLDL, some would call them, they also have the cholesterol components leading to foam cells and atherosclerosis, and then myocardial infarction, particularly, I think, if there's triglycerides being degraded for free fatty acids and inflammation. And so how common are high remnants, high triglycerides? Here's just some data. You can see 27% has level of triglycerides from 2 to 10, 11 millimoles per liter. That's also high remnants, and only 1 in 1,000 has the milky plasma. What causes high remnant cholesterol? The most important is body mass index. That's what you can see here. On the x-axis, 10 different groups of body mass index in our Copenhagen studies. So there's 10,000 individuals in each group. And on the y-axis, higher remnant cholesterol. And you can see even within the normal weight range, the green bars, the higher the body mass index, the higher the remnant cholesterol. That's the most important factor. That explains just 12% of all remnants, just body mass index. Something about residual risk. Here I take the comparator oil group from the REDUCE-IT trial. Residual risk is shown in the pink color, and this was in a group where the remnant cholesterol was just 43 milligram per deciliter or 1.1 millimole per liter, corresponding triglycerides values up here. But despite that, when you followed people and they were on statins, after 5 to 6 years, almost 1 in 3 had a new cardiovascular event. So there's a lot of residual risk there. That's the first study that recruited only people with high remnants and high triglycerides. And then there's this paper, I think, from Cos Ray's group, published in Circulation in 2018, taking the low atorvastatin group from the TNT trial, putting them into 5 different groups of triglyceride with lipoproteins, cholesterol, or I just call remnant cholesterol. It's the same calculation. As you can see, it's only the ones with high remnant cholesterol that have residual risk if they are on a statin. And then there's so many other studies that show the same, and you can see again, published at high levels. So all the clinical studies have similar conclusion. Triglyceride-rich remnants explain cardiovascular and mortality residual risk beyond statin therapy, and it's independent of LDL and HDL cholesterol levels. Something more about remnant cholesterol explains residual ASCVD risk. So here's a paper, Mia Balling from our group. She had this in JACC a couple of years ago, trying to use metabolomics data from 30,000 individuals. And what we could show here was that if you look at when you have high ApoB that is associated with more risk of myocardial infarction, what is that explained by? And 50% was explained by VLDL cholesterol or remnant cholesterol, and only 29% by IDL and LDL cholesterol. I was very surprised by these results. We actually set out to see if it was the triglycerides, and the triglyceride in VLDL could not explain the risk. Here's another paper now for Mia Johansen, also from our group. She tried to look at, in this metabolomic data set, that the increased risk you get from obesity of myocardial infarction, how much of that excess risk is explained by different risk factors. And the remnant cholesterol or VLDL cholesterol explained 40% of that excess risk. IDL and LDL explained nothing. Systolic blood pressure something, and diabetes mellitus something. And we know if you're obese, that's exactly what you get. You get high remnants, you get hypertension, and you get diabetes. Here's a complicated paper, an Edavabo. I just want to show, because often I'm told this, oh, remnant cholesterol is only calculated. So in this case, together with a Japanese company called Denkasaiken, I worked with them developing a direct assay so we could actually measure remnant cholesterol, here being IDL chylomicrons and VLDL together. And here we compared the calculated remnant cholesterol with the directly measured remnant cholesterol with this new automated assay. And when we compare with the reference group here that have low or both, then if you have low calculated but high directly measured remnant cholesterol, meaning there's more cholesterol in the remnants that you would have thought just from the triglycerides, you certainly have a higher risk of myocardial infarction. The same was true if they both were high, but particularly this one, if they're cholesterol rich and triglycerides poor, you have high risk of myocardial infarction. Here's even more data. So I'll come with some green boxes in a little while so you don't get too bored. But this is the metabolomic data set again. So Mia Johansen here we have 10 different groups of ApoB-containing lipoproteins. Here, the relative size. And here you can see from the very, very large VLDLs to the very smallest LDL. Here's the percent of these lipoproteins in plasma in these 30,000 individuals. And here we looked at what's the hazard ratio for myocardial infarction for the same number of particles, 1 times 10 to the 15th per liter. And you can see most have LDL. And this is only a 1% increase in risk for that number. But if you have some of these large VLDLs, you have extremely high risk. So the patients you see that have the very high triglyceride, very high remnants, they have extreme risk. And this is really what I call remnant cholesterol. So now we need some distraction, maybe a little bit of inspiration. So socializing, relaxing, we'll have it. Of course, Ray said, I can talk as long as I like, but people will hate me in the end because they want to go out and socialize and have wine. So I'll see what I can do. So this was from a trip from Australia. And so I actually like socializing also. And I don't know, so here's a couple of friends. And I think this is better with no comments really, right? Here's one more paper that's just online from our group, again trying to show something about remnant cholesterol. So here in the 2 Copenhagen studies, elevated remnant cholesterol, this is Benjamin that has done this paper, looking at remnant cholesterol more than 1.5 versus 0.5 millimoles per liter. And the point here is that nobody had really looked at peripheral arterial disease before. But if you look at the hazard ratio for peripheral arterial disease, it's almost 5-fold. It was 3 to 4-fold for myocardial infarction, and it was only 2-fold for stroke. So for peripheral arterial disease that is so dominated by atherosclerosis, remnant cholesterol was very important. And here's another paper, Takahito Doi, that works with me also in Copenhagen, come from Japan. We had this paper that was just accepted in JACC. We tried to see if you have higher and higher remnant cholesterol, what is the net reclassification index, or you can say how many were reclassified appropriately if you only look at the one that had very high remnant cholesterol at this level. So for example, if you look at only the one that have remnant cholesterol above 1 millipore liter, there's 20-some% that are reclassified correctly for later having myocardial infarction, and here it's up to 20%, only looking at remnant cholesterol on top of normal cardiovascular risk factors. Guidelines. Remember, guidelines these days, they only talk about non-HDL cholesterol and LDL cholesterol, but non-HDL cholesterol is actually just LDL plus remnants. So I hope for some years, maybe some guidelines will start writing about remnants also. Here are sort of like the main Canadian, European, and US guidelines. And what I want to show is that for all, whether it's secondary prevention or primary prevention, F8 or other primary prevention, they all have recommendations for LDL cholesterol. But most of them also have recommendations, let's bring down non-HDL cholesterol in addition. That means that if you bring down LDL and you still have high non-HDL cholesterol, do something about it, and that is remnant cholesterol. So here's a paper, Camilla Johansson, she had this one in JACC last year also, where we tried to do exactly that. So this is only in statin-treated patients from the Copenhagen studies, 13,000 individuals, 2,500 died. And as non-HDL cholesterol went up, they died more. But as LDL went up, they didn't die more if they were on statins. And if you look at myocardial infarctions, higher LDL does not predict who got a myocardial infarction, but non-HDL cholesterol did, meaning remnant cholesterol did. And here's the bottom line for her study, comparing really non-HDL cholesterol, all these lipoproteins together, LDL alone, and then ApoB, the black dots here. So the reference being, or you can say that if LDL is high, but non-HDL or ApoB is high, there's no increased risk in dying or myocardial infarction. But if you come down to this group, if LDL is low, but both non-HDL and ApoB is high, there's huge increases in both dying and risk of myocardial infarction, and the same if you have only one of them is high. So here's more distraction. Children, I'm sure some of you have it, and mine are particularly, so it's like, what do they say? When I tell something goes good, they say we're not very impressed really, and particularly for this talk, they're not, because when I told them I got this prize, they said, oh, isn't that the same prize our mom got 2 years of, was it 4 years ago? And well, of course, that's it. So that's the thing with children, they keep you on track, I think. Clinical use. Please use non-fasting, not just fasting lipid profiles. And here's the remnant cholesterol. So chylomicron, remnants, VLDL, and IDL that's what you should look at. In Copenhagen, we have now introduced, we had it since 2009, a total non-fasting lipid profile. We completely took away, you cannot have a fasting lipid profile anymore. And now we also not only report total cholesterol, total triglycerides, HDL and LDL, but we also report non-HDL cholesterol on everybody. We also report remnants or VLDL cholesterol. And then, of course, everybody have an Lp(a) measurement once in a lifetime. Treatment. I'm not going to go into details, just saying that, of course, if you have high remnants, triglycerides, eat less, exercise more. If there's diabetes and high alcohol, maybe do something about it. But otherwise, high and sensitive statin, what you want to do. Then there's the icosapent ethyl. I put a question mark. There's a lot of discussion about that. And then there's also the fibrates. Not fish oil over the counter. And here's just the recommendation from the ESC, EAS guidelines, the 2019s. They say, well, statin treatment is what you want to do. 1B recommendation if you have high triglycerides despite statins. And then there's this icosapent ethyl, 2AB, but this was downgraded to 2B after the publication of the STRENGTH trial. And now we have also some recommendations for fibrates. And you're probably all aware that the PROMINENT trial was stopped early for futility. So we'll have to see how the guidelines or recommendation will change after we see the result of those. Hopefully in a few months' time they will be published. For the future, I think this is very important. ApoC3 and NGPTL3 inhibition, because if they're inhibited, lipoprotein lipase can work more, and then they can reduce the remnants, primarily the triglycerides. But I think if you want to think of new drugs, you have to look at the ones that will also reduce remnant cholesterol. Something about communication. I've worked a lot about that, and US military, that found out a long time ago, keep it simple, stupid. That's why I always had something very simple to that. I started with this one in 2011, and the good, the bad, and the ugly. That's why I try to communicate. So HDL, LDL, and remnant cholesterol is the bad one. Sometimes I stopped showing it because I showed it so many times. Thanks to, here, winding up, these are all the different PhD students that worked with me over the years, and all the yellow ones are active ones. But they not all work on remnant cholesterol. I just choose to talk about remnant cholesterol today. Some work on Lp(a), FH, HDL, statin use, LDL, some on cancer, COPD, hematology, and actually other diseases as well as. Also, thanks to all the postdocs, the yellow one active at present. And then I think thank you so much for all the people that together with me supervise some of these postdoc and PhD students. We usually have a team of supervisors, and also thanks for the external funding over the years. These are all the various collaborations throughout the world that I've written papers together with, thanks to all of those. And not the least, all the places in the world that people have invited me to speak, particularly about remnant cholesterol. I'm very happy to get these invitations. Just some final comments, and I'll finish then so you can have your wine and whatever you long for. Something about what is normal. And I think over here on the right side, I show on the y-axis ASCVD risk, and here's the distribution of cholesterol in a typical population in Denmark. It could be Italy, it could be United States of America, or any other wealthy country. We started with the 4S study in Scandinavia that showed from very high cholesterol to low, the risk of ASCVD went down enormously. And then we've had all these other studies with statins, ezetimibe, PCSK9 inhibitors, and we're actually now getting LDL down here, very close to what we see in newborns. I think for the triglycerides and remnant cholesterol distribution, we just started. We only had the REDUCE-IT trial that recruited people with high triglycerides. What I hope for is that with these new drugs, ApoC3 inhibitors, NGPTL3 inhibitors, that they will recruit patients with very high triglycerides and bring it way down so we can get something like the 4S trial instead of drugs that don't reduce it very much. And maybe someday we'll realize that what we see in newborns of remnants and triglycerides, that is what is normal. What I always try to do and talk with my students about is that you can study something that is very popular. Lots of other scientists do the same. So like, for example, platelet-derived growth factor. When I was a young scientist, there were so many talks about that. There were so many talks about oxidized LDL. There were so many later talks about reverse cholesterol transport. And some of it, there's many other ones. And for example, but what I try is to, I think I learned originally from Silversmith, think outside the box. If all the other ones go this way, go somewhere else. And I think that's probably why I like the remnant cholesterol for so many years. There was not so many else but us there. But for young people, you can find something else. There's lots of other ways you can go. Don't follow the stream. So like, for example, platelet-derived growth factor, when the person that promoted that a lot, he died, then we never heard any more talks about it. So I don't hope when I die someday that nobody will talk about remnant cholesterol. So at least there's a few people that have heard about the concept, so I hope some of you will go on with it. And here I just showed you there's lots of places for you to write papers. So I did a Scopus search, just like Web of Science, you can say, and looking at how many citations per year would there be if I put in LDL cholesterol. And this is the number of papers. And you can see it's close to 1,500. For HDL cholesterol, it's also 1,500. It had a small dip, but now it's coming up again. And then non-HDL cholesterol come to about 100. And so the little remnant cholesterol, we only come to 35 citations a year. So if you want to write papers or something the others don't write about, remnant cholesterol, that's a good place to go, I think. Thank you so much to the European Atherosclerosis Society, the people that nominated me. I'm so honored they did so, for the selection commission to choose this year that I should be it, and not the least to the executive committee for finally accepting the thing. And just one more thing that gives me distraction and also inspiration, just nature. So that's my last slide. So with this, I will just finish. Thank you so much for your attention.